This episode is brought to you by Fuli Gemstones.
The daisy with rose ring, where you open up, when I was working on the collection, the collector always loved it, and I got it out, and you'd open it up and it says in French or English, you have different, they exist in various languages. I love you not, I love you passionately. So there are lots of playful rings, love rings in the 19th century. It's not all about marriage and wedding.
Welcome to If Jewels Could Talk. I'm Carol Woolton, the voice of jewellery, an author, broadcaster, and the woman who initiated the role of jewellery editor at magazines like Tatler and British Vogue. This is a podcast for everyone, for people who do like jewellery, for people who don't realise they like jewellery, and anyone intrigued by fascinating facts, new ideas, and forgotten histories. So please join me as I tell sparkly tales, meeting all sorts of people, delving into 4 centuries of jewellery culture, and investigate what's happening now. There are 2 things as old as civilization itself: love and jewellery. For thousands of years, rings have served a multitude of purposes, satisfying decorative, practical, symbolic needs. But today, we're particularly talking about the emotional use of pledging one heart to another. The love expressed by betrothal rings, commitment rings, wedding rings, engagement rings. It's the sort of bread and butter of the jeweller's art. And today we're going to delve back and see how jewellery expresses these sentiments and has evolved and changed over time. And I am delighted to welcome the Cuban-born international jewellery historian, lecturer, and author of the book, The Power of Love, Dr. Beatriz Chadour-Sampson. Beatriz, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for your invitation. Very pleased. We first met at the book launch of Power of Love at Hatchett's in 2019, indeed. So that was the first time we actually met in person.
But obviously I've known and admired your work for so many years. I mean, you're the curator of the Gobelin Museum in Lucerne, the consultant curator for the redesign of the Bollinger Gallery at London's V&A Museum, and the display of the Alice and Louis Koch collection of 1,700 finger rings in the Swiss National Museum. So there is no one better for us to talk to about rings.
No wonder you want to talk about rings. With the Alice and Louis Koch collection. Quite a few of the rings from the Koch collection also included in the Power of Love book. But when we talk about Power of Love and jewels of romance and eternity, we really have to think about the different aspects of love. Because jewelry, we think about hearts and cupids and so on, but really it is also about fertility, childbirth, creating a family, life after death. There's so many facets of love that you experience or have reflected on jewelry.
And love and friendship, love as friendship.
Love and
as
friendship,
well.
Absolutely. We don't know exactly when the first rings began, but we can talk a little bit maybe about the oldest love story that existed in ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Because you mentioned love is as old as old as the civilization. It's all about emotions, and we have a love story written in 2400 BC about Inanna, written by the first female author, in fact, Enheduanna. In ancient Sumeria, she was a priestess, and she wrote about Inanna, and Inanna didn't want to marry the fellow that was allocated to her. So her brother said to her, well, why not? Because he can give you an agate necklace for fertility. In the end, she did marry Dumuzi, the shepherd, and that is one of the oldest stories. So that's the earliest jewel from within a love story that I know of.
And I think you also say in the book that they even had sort of early prenup agreements at that time, written into clay tablets.
Yes, absolutely. In Mesopotamia, you had clay tablets with marriage contracts. It was all about economics and creating a family. Ancient Egypt had marriage contracts, 7th century BC, and the bride was given away by the father. So something we know from today. Goes back to ancient Egypt. But really where it gets more interesting from a jewelry point of view is ancient Greece. And there we know there's the marriage of Hera and Zeus, and there are stone sculptures, and Zeus lifts the bridal veil. So very interesting. She was the mother goddess. We talk about the Virgin Mary later in medieval times, but the mother goddess, the one who helped at childbirth and with family. And so this was really something that was really interesting.
Was that the first time a veil was mentioned in a
As far as I'm
ceremony?
aware, it's the first time a veil is mentioned. But let's get to the jewellery of ancient Greece, because that's really what you would like to talk about.
I quite like these customs around marriage
Well, I
too.
think the customs are really important to understand the jewellery. And of course, you're into fashion. Fashions for jewellery also reflected in the rings and jewels. But in ancient Greece, you had lovely gold jewellery. It was mainly gold. You had doves that were symbolic of Aphrodite. Later, Venus, as we know from Roman times, is Venus, Aphrodite in ancient Greece. And these beautiful gold jewels with these dangling earrings with the lovely cupids, and they were really to attract the opposite sex. So there you go, love in a different dimension. Lots of little amorous scenes engraved in gold on rings.
And when you talk in the book about Aphrodite, the goddess of love and desire, she was the mother to Eros?
Yes.
And
she was the daughter of Hera. Hera was the goddess of womanhood and childbirth and family. And Aphrodite was her daughter, the goddess of love, which we know more today as Venus. It's the same goddess, but in Roman times her name was Venus.
What's interesting is when you say the mother to Eros, god of love, now we associate that more with eroticism rather than love, don't we, that word?
Well, there was a lot of eroticism also in antiquity, dare I say, a lot of cameos with love scenes. But did they think it erotic, or was it quite normal for them? There's a wonderful sarcophagus from Etruscan times where there's a couple lying on the lid of the sarcophagus. They're lying practically as if they're in their marital bed with a sheet over them, all sculptured in stone. So that's 5th century BC. What was erotic and what was love? And do our perceptions today, maybe we have to step back and think they thought about it differently. But you're right, erotic is what we think of, absolutely.
And I suppose celebrating having sex was important because it meant that they would procreate and they were fertile.
Absolutely, that is incredibly important. And another thing that I'm reminded of is, which you also find images on rings, or sculpture in ancient Greece and Rome, and it certainly is applicable for today for the marriage ceremonies throughout, is the wreath of myrtle or different herbs that was a symbol of victorious love. Mm-hmm. We think of wreaths just for wartime, but no, this was victorious love, and they were made of all kinds of herbs. If you think today of the myrtle, it's all about love.
And you said that still in every royal wedding bouquet is myrtle.
It's certainly in the British royal family. In other countries, one has to be also very careful about ceremonies, because ceremonies vary from country to country as the laws.
I wanted to ask you, was the Hercules knot Grecian or Roman?
Both. It started, as so very often in Roman art, it followed Grecian prototypes and styles. It's very much Roman art. Greek art was very much revered by the Romans, and the early Roman art or jewelry was very much based on Greek styles and Greek techniques. It then evolved when the Roman Empire got important. The jewelry got even bigger and bigger.
So these entwined ropes that were used as sort of non-figurative motifs, do you think that initiated the phrase tying the knot?
That is something that probably could do with some more research, but I'm one always has to be a bit cautious, but there must be some connection, because the knot is inseparable. It's the Hercules knot is thought to be inseparable, and that is really the idea of a marriage of being inseparable. Love is inseparable. The Hercules knot is something you find in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and even in the Koch collection has a lovely little blue enameled 19th century ring with the knot. A very dainty little ring. It certainly lives on.
And so, do you think the Romans, it became more commonplace to swap rings?
The betrothal ring as a promise of marriage is definitely Roman, and the wedding ceremony, they didn't have the wedding ceremony as such. The ring was given after the families agreed to the marriage contract, the financial side of it, the bridal gifts, domestic as well as jewels. In fact, in Roman times, this social standing of a woman was dependent on her jewelry. The more jewelry, the higher her social standing was. So there had to be agreements of the marriage contract, and the family elder had to agree it. And then the groom would give the future bride a ring as a promise of marriage. So it's not a ring that was given during a ceremony. And then there were a 3-day ceremony. There were stag parties, as we know today, nothing new. The wreath was an important part of the ceremony, but it wasn't about the ring during the ceremony. And actually interesting is, and we'll talk about the style of ring in a moment, the interesting thing is that the marriage was finalized or formalized when the wife, then wife, was brought to the husband's family. So practically taken over the threshold.
This Roman stag party must have been something to behold.
Well, plenty of Bacchus and grapes and wine.
So what happened at the ceremony at that time? Was it the clasping of the hands that formalized the ceremony rather than the giving of rings?
Exactly. The clasping of the right hands. And it's very important it's the right hands, which we still have today. The right hand was symbolized through the goddess Fides, the goddess of faith and trust. So Fides was, the right hand was her attribute. And that meant that when you clasped the hands, it had to be the right hands. And it's very interesting that in that period, in the Roman period, you find a lot of rings, depending on what you could afford. If it was silver or gold, you had the so-called dextrarum iunctio, which means the joining of the right hands. As simple as that. So Fides, the goddess of trust, oversees the actual moment that the right hands are held. But that is not the end of the marriage ceremony. It really is when the bride is taken over the threshold into the husband's family, into the physical house. That is when the actual wedding is finalized and the marriage formalized.
And so there are so many of these fede rings, aren't there, of showing the clasped hands?
Well, the problem is that the clasped right hands, the fede ring, continues well into the medieval period, Renaissance period, 18th century, and into the 19th century. When it becomes complex are any rings from the 16th to the 19th century. Roman rings one can usually detect because they're stylistically slightly different. As the Roman Empire grew and became stronger and bigger, the size of the rings became larger. And already Pliny in his Natural History in 79 AD, he complains about the women being too overladen with jewelries. Little did he know what it was like in the 3rd and 4th century. The rings were huge, and you had them engraved on cameos, the right hands. You had them engraved in heavy gold rings. So Roman rings are usually detectable, but when it comes to, and 15th, 16th century, you have the clasp hands with inscriptions. So inscriptions help to date the rings. And then in the 16th, 17th century, you have hands holding hearts, holding diamonds, which I'm sure we'll be coming to later, and rubies. So you have them in holding, and also they're combined with religious symbols like the Jesus monogram, IHS. So the clasped hands are then changed, but the pure hands, the right hands joining each other, that goes well into the 19th century. And then for the jewelry historian, it becomes rather difficult to date.
And do you think that's the forerunner of the Irish cladder ring that shows hands clasping as well?
It must be. It must
Must
be
be.
because it's been going on. I mean, they may not have known the Roman designs, but they would have known all the medieval. Certainly, the medieval is certain by Irish claddagh rings. Medieval iconography played a role.
And so then the Christian nuptial mass started, didn't it? I suppose that was
Yes.
the next thing that changed the idea of rings and the
Well, maybe
ceremony.
we should just have a quick flashback to late Roman Byzantine period because it's rather interesting talking about rings. Because in the late Roman period and the East Roman Empire, which is the Byzantine Empire, you have rings showing the couple, the married couple, facing each other, that's late Roman. So, you have a visualization. We don't have portraits or anything, but you have these the heads facing each other in late Roman times. By the Byzantine period, we come into the Christian period, which is exactly what you've asked about. And it's interesting that you have Christ blessing the couple. You have full-length figures engraved in gold, sometimes with niello, and you've got Christ blessing the couple, all engraved on the ring. And some of them that are very elaborate, you even have a whole host of saints joining in this celebration, which actually also goes back to the Romans, because you also have scenes of all the gods wishing fidelity, prosperity, and so on. And saints do have their own meanings as well in Christianity. So I think this is quite interesting to talk about. The Christian part starts then in the Byzantine Empire, which is the East Roman Empire. Let's say sort of 7th century onwards, AD.
And is that when marriage is getting more formalized in the way of property ownership, women obeying husbands? Is that when it gets formalized,
It's
that sort of
certainly
idea?
in early medieval Europe, the church has a very influential powers and determines the role of the woman, and also divorces are not allowed. As remember, you had divorces in ancient Roman times, which was not the case in Christianity. Renaissance rings that say what God joined, let no man put asunder. You've got these gimel rings with inscriptions inside in all languages. That's quite international.
Tell me about gimel rings, because they were popular at the time, as sort of multiple hoops that fitted
Yes,
together.
that is sort of 16th, 17th century onwards. You have these puzzle rings, two rings. Very often inside, when you open the twin ring, a gimel is a twin ring. So once you open it, you have the inscription, but sometimes you even have a skeleton and a baby in swaddling clothes, which really is a reminder, not only a memento mori, but it's also a reminder of your marriage vow, until death do us part. And if you have a very beautiful ring, you've got a ruby and a diamond. And rubies and diamonds, if you look at jewelry, anything from the 16th century onwards, rubies and diamonds are classical for wedding rings, betrothal rings. The ruby is synonymous with love, red, the ruby, the heart, the blood. It's very much the center of your emotion. And a diamond is virtue and constancy. So you've got this twin ring with the inscription, there's a wonderful example in the Koch collection, but there are other examples as well, plenty of them.
Did the rings ever separate? I mean, i.e., would the man and the woman ever have one each and then bring them together?
No, it was a secret inscription inside, and the symbols of the skeleton and the baby would only have been known to the wearer. But this is an interesting point that you brought up, because we did talk earlier on about posy rings. And posy rings are rings that, well, the name posy is really a later collector's term, but it's really based on poems or love inscriptions. And in the inscriptions on rings, love inscriptions, declarations, it starts in the medieval period, 14th, 15th century, and they were the inscriptions were outside of the ring. So you knew exactly this love declaration was quite an open story. But by the time you get into the 16th, 17th century, the majority of these posy rings have the inscription inside. So it was only known to the giver and the recipient. And these were either given within a family as a sign of friendship and affection. Remember, love is not all about married couples and lovers and mistresses. It's also about friendship and affection, and the inscription is hidden inside, only known to giver and recipient. And posy rings were actually mentioned by Shakespeare.
I can't remember which of his plays it was mentioned in.
Oh, you put me on the spot now.
Yes, I know. I've read it to you.
I think it's Hamlet, and I think A Merchant of Venice.
And she's basically saying, I can't believe you've taken that ring off because that you gave me that.
Posy ring. The actual word posy is mentioned. Yes.
And it meant that you would love me.
Absolutely. And it's said that during the time of the Cromwell that they were increasingly used as wedding rings because glamorous rings with lots of diamonds and rubies would not have been suitable. But the posy ring was the collections in the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, Ashmolean, it's a very British thing. Posy rings are British.
But having said that, some of the inscriptions are in French, aren't they, mainly?
That is, I'm glad you brought that up, because French was, we have to remember, it was not only the language of love, French, but of course it was the language we, like today, English. We said the world speaks English, but in those days French was the diplomatic language at court, and it was also the well-educated spoke French. So French does not mean the ring was made in France. Whereas the Gimmel rings, if you have it in Netherlandish or you have it in German, then you're lucky as a jewelry store, and you know it was made in that area. If it's in Latin, then it's also bad luck because you don't know where it could have been made. But French is of course, we associated with the language of love, so very much so. The symbols were all about love, humble love, eternal love, perpetual love. There were very many symbols. Courtly love, that's the falcon. Who would know that a falconry scene would be a scene with courtly love? And you had a dog that was sitting on this scene, or you have them on the hunt with the falcon and the dog. And roses, of course, the roses goes back. We think about the red rose. We find that also in enamel jewels of the medieval period. Beautiful émail en rhombos pieces, and the rose goes back to Venus. It's thought of she injured herself. Now we talk about the Venus with Aphrodite, the Roman name for her, that she was injured by a thorn and a white rose turned red. So that's a lot of courtly love and symbolism. We should mention the ring brooches, which is similar to the posy ring. And you talked about what it says. Ring brooches have either the inscription, again, hidden behind, close to your heart, or you have them seen you can actually see what the inscriptions are. And very often the love and posy rings are interlinked with God and wishing protection. So it had this very religious connotation as well. And then you had some that didn't have any inscriptions in the medieval period, with rubies and sapphires, which was all about love and romantic love. Sapphires are often thought to be divine love as well. By the Renaissance period, it gets very, very complex. You've got these beautiful large jewels, which I believe were given as a gift to when they got married, as a wedding gift. There's some wonderful pieces in Cowan where you have the whole iconography of love on it. Doves, hearts, diamonds. You even have the parrot for prosperity. You have the clasped hands. So it becomes very, very complex, the iconography in Renaissance jewels. So these were gifts that were given. We have a very interesting piece in the V&A from about 1620, and it has something like 212 diamonds. There's a portrait of Rembrandt's wife. She had, I've found it also on other portraits, Italian Renaissance portraits, where the wife is wearing a cluster, a beautiful cluster of diamonds. And not only that, you find portraits where she's actually wearing all the jewels that she received for her wedding. I have found portraits of that. And you have ladies actually showing their hand. I have a betrothal and a wedding ring. It's either very often a ruby or a diamond. You sometimes find the clasp hands. I found one example of that. Then you find them with lots of rings. So was that several marriages they had through being widowed? We don't know. And Eleonora of Toledo, who was married into the Medici family in 1540, she is shown very majestically holding her hand with a Roman intaglio in her ring, with all the symbols I mentioned, the cornucopia, the dove, all the love symbols on it. It's a Renaissance ring with a Roman intaglio, and the ring still exists. And what is she showing? A big diamond ring. So here we are. I'm a humanist. I know my Latin, but I'm also a married woman with my big diamond.
Do you think the symbolism in these paintings inspired the creativity of the goldsmiths?
The creativity of the goldsmiths really goes back to design books that were made because we have to remember we have printed books. They were traveled all over Europe. The goldsmiths traveled all over Europe. So I think it's more these portraits document the jewelry of the time rather than were inspiration, because we have so many design books and they were made by artists, not goldsmiths themselves, and then distributed all over the world. In fact, I worked on a Spanish shipwreck, and I know of designs that came from Europe that were made by Chinese craftsmen for European trade, and then traveled from the Philippines to Mexico, Cuba, and then to Spain, and were traded within Europe.
That was a long journey.
Yes, and it's mind-boggling and a nightmare for a jewelry historian to then see, where does this come from?
But it's so funny that we're talking about these betrothal rings and love, when in fact love was less of a deciding factor, wasn't it? These, as you said, these weddings were more about strengthening political alliances, wealth, dynastic succession. But we're talking about the rings as love tokens.
I know, that is the ideal world, isn't it? But if we think of Napoleon and his jewelry, his love of jewelry, well, his love for Josephine was told, and he just showered her with jewels, even after she couldn't bear an heir, and they divorced in 1810. He showered her still with jewels. And they were an expression of love in this case. We know that because we also know his letters that he wrote. I've actually seen a few of them, and they're quite, you couldn't really quote them in the podcast. But then
Yes.
if you see that he then goes and travels with a huge casket to Vienna with lots and lots of jewels, and to marry Marie-Louise, his second wife. Josephine would maybe love, but Marie-Louise, was that
Was
love?
an alliance, wasn't
She
it?
really had, the casket still exists in the Kunsthistorische Museum, and she was just showered with jewels. Was that love? I don't think she was that keen on going to Paris. And then she bore a son, the King of Rome, and she was given a huge diamond necklace. Mind you, Napoleon was known to have a particular love of diamonds. But then came his adopted daughter Stephanie and Hortense, and all the Napoleonic marriages throughout Europe. Well, they were also showered with jewels, but they certainly weren't love. Those were political marriages and not love. So jewelry is not always a sign of love.
Did Josephine have a toi et moi ring for her engagement?
Well, she had the engagement ring I know of in Chateau Malmaison, is a very plain gold ring from 1796 with the initials and turquoise blue enamel. Turquoise is an interesting, talking about jewelry and rings, turquoise is, in the Renaissance and even before, turquoise is the stone of friendship. Love, you have it also. and that continues into the 19th century. So I wonder, actually talking to you, I hadn't thought about it before, that turquoise-coloured enamel. But the Trois Mois ring that you're probably mentioning is the one that was sold several years ago with a sapphire and a diamond.
Yes.
I personally don't think it was from the time of Napoleon.
So these are essentially two stones sort of kissing in the center, really, which leads us to talking about the diamond in the betrothal ring, because there is this idea people have that basically the diamond in an engagement ring is a case of brainwashing by De Beers, that De Beers came up with a strapline in the 50s, a diamond is forever, and suggested that every man spent 3 months of his salary on a diamond engagement ring. But we know it goes back so much earlier, as you've already described.
Well, we know that De Beers would also clash with Tiffany, with the Tiffany setting and the diamond that made it very popular in the 1880s. But to come back to the historical roots, we're not 100% sure when it started, but there is certainly evidence by the late 15th century that the diamond was used for engagements or betrothals. We know that Mary of Burgundy, coming from the Dukes of Burgundy, a very wealthy heiress in her own, she married Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor, and her ring was considered with a diamond, and in fact it's her initials cut and made of diamonds. So this is thought to be definitely a document of that. But we also have rings. We have rings without inscriptions, but there's a lovely ring, in a 15th century ring in the British Museum, which says Lorenzo Alena. That certainly is a love ring. So we do have evidence, and as I said, in portraits you find increasingly diamonds as rings being showing off.
And there was the wedding of Costanzo Sforza in 1475. And that's all depicted in 32 miniatures in the Vatican Library, isn't it?
Yes.
And it shows the god of marriage crowned with roses, wearing a patterned tunic, flames, and a diamond ring standing in front of the altar with burning torches.
Yes, and you also have like Marie de Medici marrying Henry IV of France, and you can see the king giving Marie de Medici the actual ring with a diamond. So there's plenty of evidence of the late 15th century onwards of diamonds being given as engagement or weddings during the wedding ceremony.
And I guess it's the hardness of the diamond and the resistance to fire, blows of the hammer, meant it was acknowledged as a symbol of fidelity. I mean, it had that idea of forever, all those years before De Beers thought of it.
Yes, absolutely. The ancient Greeks called it also a stone of the great hardness. It was always considered as a stone. Mind you, it can crack if you've got the wrong cleavage. But it's generally, it is the hardest stone. And if you cut a diamond, you have to cut it with a diamond. And so you had very often table cut and point cut diamonds. Point cut is actually the natural form of the diamond. That's the earliest diamond rings, or what look like a pyramid. It's the natural shape of the stone that's just been polished around. And then sometimes you have the point cut off, you have the table cut stone. And then, beware that when you see rings or diamond jewels on, there are also marriage portraits made when wealthy families had a portrait made of the couple after they got married. And diamond jewels, beware, they look rather black on paintings of the 16th century because there was no sparkle. It was not about the sparkle of the diamond. It really was about the hardness and being virtuous and fidelity and constancy symbolizing. But when we get to the 17th century, it's all about sparkle. You've got the rose cut by then, and you've got metal foils underneath, and it's all about the sparkle of the diamond. So beware when you're looking at paintings of the earlier periods. They're black for a reason. That's how they were set. They were sometimes set with bitumen underneath.
And I suppose that, moving on, when the 1870s, the diamond finds in South Africa, diamonds were available to everybody. And I guess then it made a fashion for diamond engagement rings.
Also, diamonds became more affordable. When in 1867 the first diamonds were found in South Africa, by the end of the 19th century, you could say dripping in diamonds, and they were certainly more affordable. So certainly more affordable.
And so when did the idea that a woman had two rings come in? Was this, some people talk about a keeper. If she had a gemstone that was precious, to keep the gemstone on her finger. Where did the idea of the wedding ring come from?
Well, there's been a question mark of the actual keeper ring, because we know it from Queen Charlotte. It was described by her lady-in-waiting that King George III gave her a ring with his portrait under a diamond, and this so-called keeper ring, which is a band of diamonds all around the hoop. But recently, a colleague in the Netherlands found one on a painting in the 17th century and a ring 17th century, where the diamonds are all along the hoop, and I also have an example in the Koch collection. So this idea of keeper ring, I'm not sure how we can really prove that. And if you are a jeweler, you shouldn't be really wearing two rings next to each other, because they actually rub against each other.
So that's going to get a lot of people thinking as they listen to this, should they take their rings off?
With love, you're going to wear both your rings together.
And so was it the church stepping in and trying to bring marriage ceremonies under their regulation that it became more of the idea that these rings had to be exchanged formally?
Yes, there would be the rings. One has to also, it's rather more complex to explain. I think in general, we certainly by the Renaissance period, you have the exchange we're given the diamond ring. When you have the exchange of rings, that's another matter. That comes up also the question of men wearing wedding rings. Laws, of course, vary from country to country. So it's very difficult to generalize that. There are lovely rings in the 19th century that certainly have, they're not all to do with marriage. It's more sort of love affairs. You've got little rings, several of them in the Koch collection. They're made like envelopes. Tiny, delicate rings, and you open them, and then there's a turquoise heart inside, or the word l'amour, and also they talk about French as a language of love. You have rings with pansies on it, French word penser, meaning think of me, and there's a fantastic ring in the Koch collection with a Galilean telescope, with a principle that goes back to Galileo, but it's definitely a man's ring, not a woman's ring. It's all science and love, and it's a diverging and a converging lens with an inscription, black on white enamel, which relates to the type of lens it's on, and it's all attraction to love and attracted to you. And the daisy with rose ring, where you open up, when I was working on the collection, the collector always loved it, and I got it out, and you'd open it up and it says in French or English, you have different, they exist in various languages. I love you not, I love you passionately. So there are lots of playful rings, love rings in the 19th century. It's not all about marriage and wedding. It's
sort of sentimental and romance
sentimental.
And desire.
It is the age of sentimental. And of course, flowers played an important role. You had rings with all kinds of flowers and brooches, and you had the hidden message. You have in the V&A, there's a lovely brooch with convolvus, which is symbolic of the bond of love, studded with turquoise. So when you were wearing that, the person who you were attracting to or expressing your love, they would have understand the language of the flowers and love. So it's not all about weddings.
And there are lots of good ideas for modern designers there, aren't there?
Absolutely.
I mean, opening up to find the turquoise, it's so gorgeous. How could you resist that?
Yes.
I found quite a amusing quote written in 1798 in the Ladies' Monthly, saying, "Always wear your wedding ring, for therein lies more virtue than is usually imagined. If you are ruffled unawares, assaulted with improper thoughts, or tempted in any way against your duty, cast your eye upon it and call to mind who gave it to you, where it was received, and what passed at that solemn time." And I thought, oh my God, divorce lawyers would be out of business if if people adhered to that now.
I think the person who wrote that or believed in that was very idealistic.
And then I suppose, I mean, you deal at the end of the book about, you know, the change, obviously changes in shifts in society and communication and movies coming into it, and how these high-profile marriages can be very influential now in what people wear.
Well, when I was writing the book, it was getting rather confusing because I did want to have some contemporary images, and I made a mistake by including Lady Gaga because was a beautiful ring. I think it was a pink sapphire, I forget now, a beautiful
and I thought,
ring.
oh my God,
But of course
divorce
the
lawyers would be out of
engagement
business
broke.
if people adhered to that now.
I think the person who wrote that or believed in that was very idealistic. Wishful, or maybe wishful thinking.
Yeah, I know, it sounds more like maybe some cleric or nun had written it. And then I suppose, I mean, you deal at the end of the book about, the change, obviously changes in shifts in society and communication and movies coming into it, and how these high-profile marriages can be very influential now in what people wear.
Well, when I was writing the book, it was getting rather confusing because I did want to have some contemporary images, and I made a mistake by including Lady Gaga because it was a beautiful ring. I think it was a pink sapphire, I forget now, a beautiful ring. But of course the engagement broke up before the actual book came out. And then we have, you probably know more about it, but Victoria Beckham and David Beckham giving a token of love. You can't really call it wedding rings or engagement rings anymore, as a token of love. I think I counted something like 14th, if it's all true. So it really gets rather complicated.
14 diamond rings.
In 2019. No, it rings of beautiful sapphires, emeralds. I think the original one was quite small with a pink sapphire or from Boodles and emeralds, and there were a whole lot of rings she received as a token of love every year. If that's true, I don't know. It's a lovely, it could be well true. A lovely story, but you sort of lose count. I don't know how many there are by now. I haven't checked that. But Amal Clooney and George Clooney, they're still married, so that was all right for quoting that.
Well, J-Lo has collected quite a few coloured diamonds, hasn't she?
Yes, but that was, of course, after the book was printed.
Yeah, I think she had a green one with Ben Affleck. She might have had a yellow one with Mark Anthony. I don't know.
Absolutely.
And a pink one. I don't know. She's got quite a collection of coloured ones, which is quite smart of her because they're the ones that are going to rise in value, those coloured diamonds.
And Ed Sheeran just got engaged at the time, and his bride-to-be was made him a ring. So that was interesting. And he wore it.
That's very nice.
Yes. So that's a different story.
So what would you describe them now? Because they're not the sort of eternal rings. We all know that now, that life's changed. Unions are going to break up, and as 1 in 2 will break up. What would you call these rings now? They're not. Are they betrothal? Are they eternity? Are they wedding? What would you call them? Or are they just commitment for the moment?
I think commitment for the moment is a good expression. Love as long as it lasts. I'm sure many rings are sold if there's a divorce. They're not kept, or maybe they are kept. I certainly think there's maybe a part 2 to the Power of Love book.
That's for sure. And of course, with the same-sex marriages,
absolutely,
that's changed everything too. I mean, do you think maybe that's the last frontier of gender equality, that men should have the diamond ring too, and not just the women?
Well, men wear jewellery in other countries more than in Britain, so that does,
I've just come back from Dolce & Gabbana over 4 days, and I have to say the men really outshine the women.
Well, my father had the best jewellery in the family. He always had the best jewels. It's a cultural thing. The Mediterranean area, the Middle East, and so on, men wore a lot of jewellery, India and so on. It's, I think, rather North European. It's rather different. So it's a cultural thing. Jewellery is a very cultural thing, how much you wear. And also the side on which you wear your wedding ring is also different in different countries.
And so you think rings will continue forever as part of these commitment ceremonies because they really are symbolic of what the couple are doing?
I think for the immediate future, definitely. Nobody has a crystal ball and can see where it goes after that. But I also mentioned in my book a completely different type of marriage ring, was the bio-jewellery project, with taking parts of each other's tooth and growing a culture and that embedding into your ring. So everything's possible.
Love in all its different forms will continue to come into couples' lives.
New materials, new symbols. Maybe don't forget we've got emojis. So rings with emojis. In the Power of Love book, I also have from a Munich jeweler, Gerd Rothmann. He made rings for the couple with their thumbprint.
That's quite romantic.
DNA.
The new romance. The new romanticism.
Wonderful. I think that's the name of the next book, New Romance.
Well, Beatriz, thank you. You will be back to talk about that. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your invitation.
Thank you for listening. For more information about this and other episodes of the podcast, please go to our website, carolwoolton.com/podcasts. Do share it any way you can if you've enjoyed it, and we love to have a rating and a comment. And indeed, on the website, there is somewhere where you can click on to vote for us, should you feel like it, because we're up for a British Podcast Award and we'd really appreciate your support. For more information about our sponsors, that is FooleyGemstones.com. And join us again in 2 weeks for the next Jewelled Nugget. I'll be very happy to be hosting Justine Picardy, who is the former editor of Harper's Bazaar. She's the author of 6 books. And we will be talking about Coco Chanel, because on the eve of the new blockbuster exhibition opening at the V&A on Gabrielle Chanel Fashion Manifesto, which will have 200 of her looks and accessories, perfume and jewellery, we are going to be discussing Justine's updated biography on Coco Chanel, the legend and the life. She spent 20 years researching Coco Chanel. She knows more about this woman and how she's influenced all of us, how we dress now, than anyone in the world. So you're really going to enjoy it. I really look forward to the conversation and you joining me in 2 weeks. Bye-bye. If Jewels Could Talk with Carol Woolton is produced by Natasha Cowan, music and editing by Tim Thornton, graphics by Scott Bentley, illustration by Jordi Labanda, and you can find me on Instagram at Carol Woolton.